I actually want to share with you a thought from last week's Parsha, not this week's, that is very, well, also something from this week, but that is actually very relevant to the holiday of Shavuos. We've begun the Chumash, the fourth Chumash of the Torah, which is Chumash Bamidbar, and the English term for that Chumash is the Book of Numbers. And that is actually a very, very good name. In fact, that's the rabbinic name. The rabbinic name for the Book of Bamidbar is Chumash HaPikudim, which means the Chumash of countings, the Chumash of census, or censai. And that is because the book is bracketed with two countings of the Jewish people. One is a counting of the generation that left Mitzrayim, and the other is the counting of those who entered Eretz Yisrael. And I think we did talk about that last week, but what I want to add is this. The Parsha we have this week is Parshas Naso. And it is very rare that Naso is read before Shavuos. Almost every single year, Naso is the Parsha after Shavuos. Now, do you know that Parshas Naso is the largest Parsha in the Torah? But for a Baal Koreh, it is not the most difficult to read. Because at the end of Parshas Naso, we talk about the dedication of the Mishkan, and every single day, a different head of a tribe brought korbanos, and for 12 days in a row, the identical korban was brought. It's not just a single animal. Animals and gold and silver and incense and flour. And the Torah repeats the entire list 12 times with the same trup. That's why I say for a Baal Koreh, it's not that difficult, because the same trup is repeated over and over and over and over and over again. Now we know the Torah is very economical in repetition. We know the Torah does not repeat words, the Torah does not repeat sentences. So here, the first Nasi who brought the korban on the first day, this is Nisan, the first 12 days of Nisan, was the head of the tribe of Judah, Yehuda, whose name was Nachshon ben Aminadav. He's a famous guy, right? You know what Nachshon was. Nachshon was the person when the Jewish people are waiting at the Red Sea and they're panicking and the Egyptians are coming after them and they have no place to go other than the ocean itself. And they were afraid, and some people said, let's commit suicide, and some said, let's fight the Egyptians, and some said, let us go back and surrender. And others said, let us call out to the nations of the world to have mercy on us, like United Nations. I always thought they were the most foolish of the group. But Nachshon jumped into the water. And the water went up to his neck, and some say up to his nose. And he had faith. And the water split. And he was the head of the tribe of Yehuda, who had such emunah that he was willing to put his life on the line, confident that God would go through. By the way, there's a famous expression in the Gemara that making it, the Gemara asks in Sotah, what does God do? Now that God made the world, like how does he spend the rest of his time? Like there's not a lot to do anymore. So it says, oh, Hashem spends his time making shidduchim. He determines who should marry whom. So a Roman princess heard this, and she said, that's not such a big deal. I can do that. And she just took 30 male slaves and mated them with 30 female slaves. You're getting married to each other. She made 30 marriages in one day. So the next day, the men had black eyes and the women had broken noses, and she saw that making a shidduch is not so easy. And the expression the Gemara uses is, making a marriage is as difficult as the splitting of the Red Sea. Quite amazing. It compares making marriages to splitting the Red Sea. And people want to know, like, what's the comparison between marriage and splitting the Red Sea? I'm just mentioning this as an association from Nachshon, who jumped into the Red Sea. So I'll give you two explanations. The first is an explanation of the Maharal. And the Maharal says the nature of the comparison is by way of opposites. Because look at the splitting of the Red Sea. It is the nature of water to come together. And God splits that which normally comes together and made them separate. That's a miracle. When you take something whose nature is to come together and you separate them. Marriage, the miracle is of the opposite way. It is the nature of a human being, I'll explain this, to be alone. And the miracle of marriage is that which would normally be alone comes together. Now you may ask, what does the Maharal mean by saying it's the nature of man to be alone? It's the other way around. We seek companionship. We seek union. Aristotle remarked, man is a social animal. So what does the Maharal mean when he says it is the nature of a man to be alone? Maharal does not mean a man wants to be a hermit. That's not the case. But it's the nature of all of us that we focus primarily on our own selfish needs and our own ego, even in the context of a relationship. That even when we seek relationships, we tend to seek relationships that give us what we want. Looking after number one. The miracle of marriage, when it works, sometimes we don't do enough to make it work, is that we're able to transcend our egotism and our selfishness. And as the Gemara said, we love our wives as we love ourselves. We honor our wives more than we honor ourselves. Okay, so when you date, keep this Maimer Chazal in front of your consciousness at all times. A Jewish husband loves his wife as he loves himself. He honors her more than he honors himself. And that, the Maharal says, is a miracle, because that's not human nature. Human nature is to look after number one. When one can achieve in a relationship a transcendence of the ego, that is as miraculous as the splitting of the Red Sea. Because in the splitting of the Red Sea, that which is naturally together was separated, and in marriage, that which is naturally separated comes together, hopefully, in a selfless union. Again, it's a very, very important idea. They tell a famous story, or you probably have heard the story, about a boy in a yeshiva who was ravenously eating some fish. He loved fish. So the rabbi asked him, "Why are you eating the fish so quickly?" So the boy said, "I love fish." So the rabbi said, "So something that you love, you chew up and spit out the bones? Is that what you do with something that you love? If you loved fish, you would get it in an aquarium and you would keep it alive and you would feed it every day. You don't love fish. You mean you love you, and one of the ways you satisfy what you like is by eating fish." Right? Now, unfortunately, although chewing up fish isn't so bad, but unfortunately, when we say we love somebody, we sometimes mean it in the same way as that boy said he loves fish. We use people for our gratification. We use them because they give us things. We don't think about what we can give. We don't think about how we can help. We don't try to see the world through the perspective of the other. Okay, so splitting of the Red Sea is the together gets put apart, and marriage, that which would think egotistically and egocentrically about oneself, one thinks about the other. There's another explanation about the splitting of the Red Sea that I once heard from a tour guide many, many years ago. And he said the following: every tribe, right, the splitting of the Red Sea, every tribe had its own pathway, but it was a concentric circle. They didn't cross anything. They actually came out on the same side. So imagine 12 concentric semicircles. Now, if you think about that, that means the tribes that were in the outer semicircles had a much longer trip than the tribes in the inner semicircles. Some tribes had a shorter trip. Some tribes had a longer trip. He says that's a shidduch. He says some people have a relatively short journey they have to go. Other people have a long journey. But B'ezras Hashem, everybody comes out on the right side. It takes a little bit of time. One should not give up. One has to have emunah in Hashem, emunah in yourself, that there is someone in the world that is right for you, and you are right for them. And together, you will build a home of kedusha and of goodness and of joy, even if it takes a little longer. Right? So don't give up. A third explanation to this Maimer Chazal, comparing marriage to Yam Suf, goes back to Nachshon, leap of faith. And that is, people make lists. I have, because I have 115 qualities I am looking for in my wife. And the girl has 120 qualities she's looking for in the husband. And now this girl's no good because she only has 105 and not 110, whatever it would be. And lists are important in the sense that one should have a sense of what they're looking for in life. But you got to be flexible, meaning you can't expect perfection in another person if you're not perfect, right? None of us are perfect, meaning what right do I have to demand a certain level if I myself am not there? So Nachshon was willing to jump into the sea even though he wasn't sure, even though there was no clear evidence. There was a leap of faith in which he had to trust, even though he did not have the empirical evidence to prove it. So a shidduch too involves a certain notion of a leap of faith, of kind of making decisions, even though you don't have certainty. A requirement of certainty, I understand you try to be logical, you try to think out any decision in life, but to require an excessive level of certainty is very, very paralyzing, because ultimately it freezes you and paralyzes you that you don't do anything. Can't move here because I don't know, can't get married, I don't know, can't take this job because I don't know. They tell the story about a donkey, that donkeys are actually very intelligent, but they're very cautious animals. In fact, when people say donkeys are stubborn, little digression about a donkey, it's not that they're stubborn, it's that they are very careful and cautious. So when you try to lead them somewhere, if they're not convinced that it's totally safe, they don't move, as opposed to a horse. It's precisely the donkey's intelligence that makes it cautious. So that's really what it is. The stubbornness is caution. But caution can be excessive. So they tell the story about a donkey that died of starvation because it was equidistant between water and grain, and it couldn't decide which was the better choice to make, so it got nothing and died of starvation. That is a very, very good analogy for human beings who are consumed with indecision. Sometimes you just have to take the plunge, like Nachshon ben Aminadav. Okay, all of this was a long digression. But going back to the Parsha. So, Rosh Chodesh Nisan, 1 year after they left Mitzrayim, we built a Mishkan. And we're dedicating a Mishkan. And the heads of the tribe of Israel are bringing offerings, inauguration offerings, in honor of the dedication of the Mishkan. And the very first person who brings the first offering is Nachshon ben Aminadav of the tribe of Yehuda, and he brings beautiful offerings, animal offerings, and covered wagons to transport the utensils of the Mishkan, etc., flour, incense, gold, silver. And then the Torah goes through all the other Nisim, the other 11, and each one brings exactly the same thing. Exactly the same thing. Why does the Torah have to repeat it? Just say what Nachshon brought, and that said, and every Nasi brought the same thing. The Torah doesn't waste words, and this is absolutely a waste of words, superficially. It repeats the same thing 12 times. And this is not a one pasuk repetition. It's around 7 or 8 verses. 12 times. That's 96 verses. So what's going on? So I want to give you 2 answers to that question. One of the answers actually ties into a theme we talked about last week. And that is, it is possible for two people to do the identical action in what is called chitzonios. Chitzonios is externalities. Externally, we are doing the same thing. But internally, the actions are totally different. Each person has their unique perspective, their unique kavana, their special motivations, or in a negative sense, maybe one person is doing it with a lot of kavana and the other person has no kavana. I mean, that's an obvious situation. But even if you have two righteous people doing it, so everybody has kavana, everyone has intention. But the intentions can be very, very different. The Medrash tells us, the Medrash on this parsha, which is a huge, huge Medrash, shows that each tribe had a distinct and unique symbolism in their actions that was different than any other tribe. So the gold bowl that Yehuda brought represented a certain idea that was different than the same gold bowl that Yisachar brought. And therefore the Torah repeats it 12 times. Because spiritually, there were 12 different offerings. Although bechitzonios, they were the same, right? These are the important words to know. Chitzonios is externality. Panemios is the internality, the internal nature of a mitzvah. And by repeating the same chitzonios 12 times, the Torah is intimating that in the panemios, it was very, very different. And you can go through, again, the Midrash is so voluminous, there's no way we could cover it. But every single action had a distinct and unique resonance. They were not just duplications of each other. Now, we mentioned last week the idea that there are two different types of unity that can exist in a community. We call them the melting pot versus the salad bowl. Right? The melting pot is a type of unity which is premised on sameness, conformity, homogeneity, obliteration of differences. We're kind of all the same. Like a melting pot. I gave the unappetizing example of cholent on Wednesday afternoon, which you don't want to keep it that long, where all the distinct ingredients kind of become gook, and you can't even tell what is that and what is that. Salad bowl unity is a very different type of unity. That's where you have different colors, different textures, different tastes. They all meld together, but you still see the peppers and the lettuce and the tomatoes and the celery and the olives, whatever you're putting in there. Because there, the beauty of the combination lies in the diversity and uniqueness of each of the ingredients that is contributing to the whole. Now, the concept of tribes in Am Yisrael is very much a salad bowl unity. Again, I'm repeating a little bit what I said last week, because the concept is tribes are very important in the Torah. Different flags, different heads of tribes, different encampment in the desert. Once we get to the land of Israel, tribes had their own territories. Now today, tribal consciousness is largely no longer in our minds simply because most of us don't know. I mean, we know if you're a Kohen or a Levi, we know you're from the tribe of Levi. Okay, that we know. But you don't know if you're Yehuda, Binyamin, Yisachar, Zebulun. You don't know. So I don't go around thinking, oh, I'm a Reubenite, I'm a Shimonite, I'm a Yisacharite. It's not part of our consciousness. But in the time of the Torah and the Tanakh later, it was a very, very important part of your identity. And one wonders, why should tribes be important? Isn't the only thing that's important that, number one, I'm a human being, and number two, I'm a Jew? Like, why do you have to subdivide it beyond that point. But what God is teaching you here is that because each tribe had its own unique spiritual mission, God is saying, no, I don't want you to just be a generic Jew. I want you to be a Jew with a unique sense of mission and identity, a nuance that is different than the collectivity. And that is the significance of tribal breakdown, which then gets further broken down into the individual unit. Right? That's what we call the salad bowl, or the tapestry, or the mosaic, or the symphony, or the garden of many flowers. You can use all sorts of metaphors to describe it. Unity is not conformity. Unity is not homogeneity. Unity is not sameness. Rather, the glory of Hashem is that within the framework of Torah and mitzvos, which is our common conformity, we find our unique expression. So consequently, the repetition of the externalities of the korban actually highlight that the panimiyot of the korbanot are all different. And each of us has to bring the uniqueness of our personalities into Avodat Hashem. Again, I don't remember how much I said of this last week, but I said this is often a challenge for someone that is new to Judaism, because you bring from the outside world certain talents, whether it's poetry, music, singing, whatever it might be, basketball playing, whatever it might be. And these might be talents or abilities that are not necessarily mainstream in the yeshiva or religious culture. And the question is, what do I do with that? Now, sometimes there is a pressure, sometimes external, but often internal, that somehow this doesn't fit where I am, so I got to get rid of it. I got to disregard it. I have to kind of obliterate it from my personality so I fit in better. That's a very natural response, especially when you have a certain measure of insecurity. And I understand this idea. You come to a new environment, with new norms of behavior, and you kind of wonder, you get insecure, like, can I do this? Can I do this? Can I say this? Can I make this joke? Or somehow they're going to look, a person doesn't know. I mean, you come to a new culture generally. You just don't know the rules that well, even if you learn Torah and you're already religious. You're in new territory, although we won't bite. But, so people will often sacrifice things that are very important to them because they feel it's not part of being yeshivish or whatever it is. So what I would suggest to you is that, listen, there are things you have to give up. I mean, if I shouldn't give this example. I mean, if you were a male stripper in a nightclub, okay, there are compromises that have to be made. But generally speaking, if Hashem gave you a talent and Hashem gave you a passion, then that is one of the avenues by which you will glorify Hashem and bring honor to His name. Yiddishkeit is not about obliterating yourself. It's about being able to express what is within you, within a framework of Hashem's Torah and mitzvahs. And that is why the Torah makes such a big deal about each tribe having its own unique path, and each individual having their own unique path. Because on one hand, you look at the world and you say, well, everybody dresses the same, everybody does the same thing all the time. Well, okay, to some degree, there is a conformity within the religious world. But you also have to discover, for you and for your children later, the notion that they are individuals. And the spark of light that is within them is unique to them. And that spark should not be extinguished or ignored. Right? So the challenge is, how do you create a cohesiveness of a community and at the same time celebrate the uniqueness and sanctity of every individual? So b'kitzur, this is answer number one, why the Torah repeats the 12 korbanot of the heads of the tribes, because it's not a repetition. Everybody did it differently. Everybody had different intentions, different perspectives. And therefore the repetition of the chitzoniot is a sign that in Pnimiot it was all different. But now I want to give you another answer, which I think is also an interesting idea. When we look at the Nesiim are the heads of the tribes, the 12 Nesiim, so who is the real hero here? So I would suggest the real hero is the head of the tribe of Yisachar, who brought on day 2. Day 1, Rosh Chodesh Nisan. Nachshon ben Aminadab of the great tzaddik brings a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful offering. Now it's day 2. It's the second guy's turn. How does he view day 1? He could have said, this is a contest, huh? He's trying to bring a fancy korban. I'll do it better. Who told him to bring the same offering? He could have decided, I'm going to make it better. He would have turned it into a contest. But instead, he decided, when it comes to serving God, we're not in competition. We're all on the same page. We're all on the same team. You know, it's similar. Lahavdil reminds me, when George Washington, who was the general who led the Revolutionary War, became the first president of the United States, and that was an obvious choice. Everybody knew he would be the first president of the United States. There were a lot of things. People wanted to make him king. He was offered, let him be king of America, whatever it would be. And he didn't want that. And then, after he ran for 2 terms, they wanted him to run for a 3rd term or even be president for life. And Washington turned it down. The minhag of America, now it's in the Constitution after FDR had 4 terms, but from George Washington in the 1700s to Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the 1940s, no president ever ran for more than 2 terms. There was no din that way. There was no halacha that you could only have 2 terms. But this was minhag. You see, the power of minhag was even in American law. The minhag was no more than 2 terms. Franklin Roosevelt happened to run for 4 terms. He died shortly after the 4th term. And then they passed the constitutional amendments that you can't have more than 2 terms. But until FDR, it was only a minhag. People kept the minhag. Why did Washington establish that? See, Washington had a very strong historical sense. Washington knew that because he was the first, everything he did would be the precedent of how the country would develop. And he didn't want the idea of president for life, a president that's a king, a president who stays in power forever. He wanted the idea that the president was a rotating position, and after you've had it for a while, you go back into regular life, and somebody else takes over. He established that idea. So I'm suggesting the Nasi of Yisachar, day 2, the day 2 guy, is the hero of the saga, because he established that we're not out to outdo each other. We're not out to show I'm better than you. We serve Hashem together. And that made the other tribes do the same thing. Because once the second guy said, we're just going to repeat what was done, so the 3rd person, 4th person, 5th person, down to the 12th person, said, we're going to do the same. No competition. Judaism is not a zero-sum game that, if I win, you lose, vice versa. We're all working together for the same goal. There's a beautiful, beautiful story about the great Panovich HaRav, Rav Yosef Shlomo Kahaneman, who died in 1968. Panovich, which you probably know as the great yeshiva in Bnei Brak, but Panovich was a city in Lithuania. Before World War II, Rav Kahaneman was the Rav of the city of Panovich. There were 800 great rabbis in Lithuania. Before the war, 799 of them were murdered by the Nazis. The Panovich HaRav was the only one of 800 Lithuanian rabbis who survived. And as a result, Rav Kahaneman was a man who was very seized with a mission. He wondered, why did God give him life? And he was literally obsessed with the building of Torah throughout the world. The Panovich Yeshiva, hospitals, orphanages, elementary schools, girls' schools. He did everything. Panovich Yeshiva was maybe his proudest achievement, but it was only one of hundreds and hundreds of things that he did. He was a gadol b'Torah, but also a legendary fundraiser. In fact, the Satmar Rebbe, in 1968, when Neil Armstrong and the other two got to the moon, so people began debating, can there be life on the moon? Is there life on Mars? Life on other planets? So the Satmar Rebbe, who was very sharp, said, I don't know about the scientific literature, but I am convinced there is no life on other planets, because if there would be life on other planets, the Panovich HaRav would be collecting money there. And if the Panovich HaRav didn't go to the moon or Mars, there's nothing there. That's what the Satmar Rebbe said. So he was really, really indefatigable fundraiser. And the nature of his personality was such. He was mamish a gadol b'Torah, but so easy to talk to, full of jokes, full of stories. He could relate to anybody, from the greatest Talmid Chacham to a non-religious Jew who didn't know anything at all, and non-Jews as well. They all felt comfortable with him. So he was very successful in raising money because he had the personality for it, as it were. And it wasn't a fake. He genuinely had a tremendous love for Yidden. A love for Yidden and a love really for all human beings. And they felt it. So the story goes that he would sometimes come to the U.S., and he came to Chicago to raise money. This was in the 1950s. And in those days, they didn't even have jet flights. They had propeller flights, and it wasn't even direct to Chicago anyway. So it may have taken him 20 hours to go from Tel Aviv to get to Chicago. And he gets there because he knew a lot of people in Chicago, and he would get a lot of money. And lo and behold, when he enters the shul where he's going to give a drasha, there's another meshulach from a much lesser-known yeshiva, Navardik, who came to Chicago at the same time to collect money. And when the Navardika meshulach sees the Panovich HaRav, he turns white because he says, there's no competition here. He's going to get like all of the money, and there'll be nothing left over for me because I'm not him. So initially he was dismayed, but then he figured, okay, tonight is not a money collection night. I'm going to sit and enjoy a wonderful shir, a wonderful drasha. I'm just going to sit in the audience. I'm not going to even bother collecting money. It's what we say, a bracha levatala. It's a blessing in vain. It's not going to work. So the Panovich HaRav was his usual captivating self. Torah, Musar, history, anecdotes, stories, jokes. He has everybody enthralled and hypnotized, really. They really love it. And they're pulling out their checkbooks, and they're going to write, generous checks for all of the good that the Panovich HaRav does. At the end of his drasha, he says, Rabosai, I have a favor to ask you. There's a man here from Bnei Brak, also from Bnei Brak, who is connected to a very, very beautiful yeshiva. And his yeshiva is very much worthy of support. So I would ask you that whatever money you are going to give to me, give to him, because he is also doing some really, really wonderful work. Well, suffice it to say that this Meshulach from the Vardik did a lot better than he ever did on his own, because he got everything that would have gone to the Panovich HaRav went to this Meshulach from the Vardik. So the Meshulach, who not only heard a wonderful drasha but got a lot of money for his cause, went over to the Panovich HaRav afterwards and said, Rebbe, I'm really so grateful. This is a phenomenally kind thing, but I really don't get it. You traveled 20 hours to get to Chicago to collect for your yeshiva, for all of your institutions. And you're not a young man, and it was a hard trip, and you really invested blood, sweat, and tears to get here. And how could you just give it all up to me? So the Panovich HaRav said, what do you mean, give it all up? We're in the same business. We're on the same page. We are here to strengthen Torah and encourage Torah learning. If I earned enough money or collected enough money that 10 Avrechem, 10 Kolol people could study Torah for a week because of what we collected, Why do I care if they're sitting under the roof of Panovich? Under the roof of Navardik? What's the difference? It's the same thing. 10 people are learning Torah. I don't care if you get the money or I get the money. It's God whose name is being glorified by the people learning Torah. This is absolutely a remarkable story because very, very, even if you take a great Rosh Yeshiva, even a genuinely great Rosh Yeshiva, I mean, they have a proprietary interest in their particular institution. By the way, one exception to that, in addition to the Breitowitz Rav, was Rav Nosson Tzvi Finkel, the Rosh Yeshiva of Mir, who died a few years ago. Tragically, he had multiple sclerosis for many, many years. But in spite of his disability, he continued to learn and to teach and to travel and to collect money and to build up his yeshiva. To Mir is the largest yeshiva in the world. But he was indifferent. He would often, when he would collect money for his yeshiva, if he saw someone in Lakewood who needed it, he would give it to him and give it to him. He would give it to like any yeshiva, any kollel, anybody who needed it. Until Mir made a rule that the Rosh Yeshiva was not allowed to handle any money. Meaning to say, the Rosh Yeshiva would come and somebody else would collect the money because if Nosson Tzvi Finkel wasn't collecting for Mir, he was collecting for Yiddishkeit. And if he saw other causes, he would give the money there. Well, the precedent to that is none other than the Panovich Rav. And that's something to think about. Obviously, we want to accomplish things in life. We want to learn. We want to grow great in Torah. And when we achieve those goals, we should be happy with ourselves, yes. But we should also be happy when someone else achieves the goal, because God's name is being glorified. Sometimes we have this feeling, it's hard to escape. Somebody's accomplishing this and that, and I didn't accomplish that. I feel a little jealous. But if you look at it in terms of objectively, Hashem's name is being glorified. I rejoice not only when I'm the one that's doing it, I rejoice if anybody is doing it. It's a good thing. I'll just end with a little vignette. The Breitowitz Rav died in, I believe, 1968, and I was in 9th grade. It was my first year so now you know how old I am. That was my first year at Ner Yisrael in Baltimore. I was a 9th grader, and I was just in high school. And when the Breitowitz Rav died, though, they assembled the whole yeshiva and the high school together to hear eulogies, haspedim, for the Breitowitz Rav. And my Rosh Yeshiva, Rav Ruderman, was a friend of the Breitowitz Rav. He knew the Breitowitz Rav very, very well. And it was all in Yiddish. I really had no idea what was going on. I didn't understand anything. But the one thing I remember, so I'm sitting there and I'm kind of, I'm just 9th grader, I'm falling asleep. And all of a sudden, I never saw this since. I only saw this once in my life, not before and not since. The Rosh Yeshiva started crying and he said to everybody, sit on the ground. Get off your chair. Sit on the ground in mourning for the Breitowitz Rav. And it was a very powerful experience. I had never, again, and I have not seen it since. But he said, we all sat on the ground. L'zeicher the Breitowitz Rav. Now, because the Breitowitz Rav was such an all-encompassing person, his relationship to the state of Israel was different. I mean, he was obviously Haredi, of course, ultra Haredi. But it was very different than other Haredi Gedolim. He flew the flag of Israel on Yom Ha'atzmaut. He did not say, his yeshiva did not say Tachanun on Yom Ha'atzmaut. Meaning he kind of looked at everybody in a very positive, good way. Now, there's a famous story. He was also a man of a great sense of humor, in which somebody said, well, if you're such a Zionist, why don't you say Hallel on Yom Ha'atzmaut? And the famous immortal quip was, what do you mean? I follow the best Zionist customs. I do Ben Gurion's custom on Yom Ha'atzmaut. Don't say Hallel, don't say Tachanun. He said, that's the best stuff. So you can't accuse me of not being a Zionist. I do Minhag Ben Gurion on Yom Ha'atzmaut. Or they have another story where some person, this may be a made-up story, I'm not sure, but some person gave him $1 million and said, I'm giving you $1 million to start a school, but the condition is the students don't wear yarmulkes. If they're going to wear a yarmulke, I'm giving you no money. So the Breitowitz HaRav started a girls' school. So he figured out ways. Actually, that's a pretty stupid donor, really. I mean, the donor should have realized that. But okay, but be it as it may. So really, I look back sometimes, and Baruch Hashem, we always have Gedolim. God always gives us leaders. But and it's always like people say, "Oh, the grass was greener then. I remember, the good old days." We really shouldn't say that because every generation is special and unique. But I kind of miss those types of Gedolim a little bit, which are, it's not the orientation, for reasons, and this is a more complicated, maybe I shouldn't open up something that's a complicated discussion, but for various reasons, the Torah world has become a little more aggressive, a little more combative, a little more exclusionary, and again, there may be good reasons for this. I'm not even saying this as a criticism, but I kind of miss that sweetness, that openness, that we saw in the Breitowitz HaRav, that I saw in Rav Moshe Feinstein, in Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky, in my own Rosh Hashiva, Rav Yaakov Ruderman. It's not so common these days. And it's something that, we're missing a little bit. But as I say, Baruch Hashem does give us Gedolim that lead us in all sorts of important ways. So we